Well, good morning, everyone. For those new faces that I see out there today, I do have to start off by saying that this is not normal. Normally, I like to stay hidden well behind the piano and not come out here and address you directly, but I was asked to cover a service today. Usually when I do that, I like to do something about music. Now today, I'd like to dispense with that for a minute. When I looked at the calendar, I saw that today was, of course, Cesar Chavez Day. And Cesar Chavez is someone that I did not start out in life knowing about. They did not teach Cesar Chavez and his history in school. I mentioned it to my children, and they all said, "Oh yeah, Cesar Chavez, he marched all the way across with the farm workers and changed everything." And I went, "Wow, I'd never heard of this." So the first thing that I did was went to Wikipedia. Now, I will tell you that there are a lot of facts out there about Cesar Chavez's life. That was pretty long for a children's story, but there are a lot more facts beyond that. There's talks about fasting in order to get recognition for his cause. There's so many stories that it's very hard to boil down what actually to talk about when it comes to Cesar Chavez. But all of it was just facts. And I wanted to go a little bit further than the facts about his life and actually get to the character behind it. Why do we teach our children now about Cesar Chavez? Why is that something that we hold important? And to do that, I would like to go back a little bit into something that I was raised with as a child, which is old-timey cowboy movies. And in particular, a book that I've come back to many times throughout my life, which is True Grit by Charles Portis, which I see a lot of people shaking their head. If you've read this book, or if you've seen the movie that won John Wayne an Oscar, or the 2010 remake made by the Coen brothers, there's something about this movie or the story that just draws you back over and over and over again. And there's a concept in this story that we hear about talked at church. It's talked about in the stories that we share here. It's talked about endless times in the religious texts that we draw our histories from. But it's not something that we really hold in the same way that Charles Portis names it. He just names this grit, right? And so all of the characters in the story True Grit show either an amount of grittiness or a lack of grittiness. So I'll start with the latter. The first is this character named Tom Cheney. Now, Tom Cheney is one of the first people that we're introduced to in the book. What happens is Tom Cheney is a hired farmhand, and he works for the main character's father. And one day he's out gambling and he loses all his money that he worked so hard for. And he's been drinking and he says, "I'm going to go back to my boarding house, I'm going to go get my gun and go get my money back because they cheated me." Right? He takes no responsibility for his actions. So he goes back to the boarding house, he grabs his gun, and while doing that, the good Mr. Ross stops his hired hand and says, "You've been drinking, think this through. You don't want to approach this situation with violence." And in that act, Cheney shoots him dead for whatever reason and flees into the wild territory. Now, throughout the book, Charles Portis calls Cheney a coward. And when we later meet up with Cheney, he is faced with this act that he did. And his answer to this is something that he says several times throughout the book: "Everything is against me." Now, he shot a man in cold blood, and that's his answer. It all went bad. I didn't mean to do it. It all came against me. And so Tom Cheney is someone that is held up without grit. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have this character named Maddie Ross. Now, Maddie Ross is 14 years old, and she comes into town where her father was killed to settle his affairs. And in her mind, settle his affairs is to make sure that someone goes and captures Tom Cheney. And so she goes about with whatever money she has and with the backing of her lawyer, and she seeks out someone with grit, which is what she has. And And quite frankly, it's about all that she has. She is grittiness through and through. She goes through this book just threatening people until she gets her way. I will send my lawyer after you. I will tell on you. She's a 14-year-old girl. She will tell on you. And she says, I want someone with grit. So she, instead of going back to her home and family like she's been told to go to, she goes out and hires this man named Rooster Cogburn. John Wayne is Rooster Cogburn. So when her lawyer, who's a good family friend, finds out about this, he writes these wonderful words to her. He says, "You are a pearl of great price to me, but there are times when you are an almighty trial to those who love you." That's another aspect of grit. We'll come back to that in a minute. So I have to find some inspiration in this character of Maddie Ross. There's something about her that just draws people back to this story over and over and over again. Now, it is 2019, and we live in a time where there is a lot of lack of justice. There's social injustice out there in the world. There are things that are happening, and the logic behind them is enough to drive you crazy sometimes. You read these things and say, why does no one stop this? Right? Maddie Ross, I think, is someone that I've taken a kind of fantastical view of, which is what would happen if I dropped Maddie Ross and her grittiness into 2019. And I'll tell you that Maddie Ross is exactly the person I would want to be here in 2019. Maddie Ross is exactly the sort of person that would be out there marching with the Black Lives Matters. She would be out there standing up for the refugees who are running away from areas that are overrun by crime and violence and trying to get their family to freedom, and then coming to a place that they hope that they'll be safe and finding a blocked door. Maddie Ross would be the sort of person who would rail against these things. She would rage against them no matter what. I know that because I can cite an example in the book. Early on, now this book takes place in 1873, and I'll tell you that Maddie is ahead of her time even by today's standards. In 1873, and even in 1968 when the book came out, the first person that she travels with is a neighbor of hers who happens to be an African American. You hardly know that except that Maddie has to tell you that because she travels with him. She describes him, this gentleman, Yarnell, as being a, quote, good man who is thrifty and industrious. And if you know this character, a good man is probably the highest praise that she comes up with for anyone in the book. And when a racist train conductor tries to get him to move, she gets in the way and threatens this train conductor with her lawyer. So this instance makes me go, wow, I really wish we had here today. There are people out there, I think, that would be in need of a great ally, like Maddie Ross. Now, I couldn't raise up the story without also mentioning Rooster and what makes him gritty. So he is a person that, as I mentioned, Maddie hires to find her father's killer. What makes him gritty? Well, as one character describes him as being someone who never misses an opportunity to pull a cork, which by that means he loves his whiskey. However, Rooster's grittiness is really found in his ability to get things done. He's also described as a man without fear. A great example of this in the story, he tells of his time in the Civil War, and he says, I got on my horse, grabbed my 2 guns, and I rode against 7 people who were riding towards me. And Maddie says, I think that you're lying. And he says, no, that's the truth. And she goes, well, I think you're exaggerating. And his answer to her is that if you go for a man hard enough and fast enough, and he don't have time to think about how many is with you, and he thinks just about himself and how he gets clear of the wrath that is about to set down upon him. So that's Rooster. Okay, now, I'm not up here to give you a book report on a book that came out 50 years ago. The sermon is about si se puede, and what that means. We talked a bit about Cesar Chavez, and as I mentioned, there are so many facts about Cesar Chavez that it's very difficult to go into all of them. I think that picture book did a really good job of laying it out for me. I feel like I at least know as much as my son and daughter know about Cesar Chavez, and that puts me ahead of it. He's famous for many, many things, but the phrase si se puede is one that I think will live on way, 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 way after him. So many have become familiar with the words. When I mentioned that's what I was going to title this sermon, so many came up and said, it means this, and then I corrected them. They weren't wrong. they had the correct translation, but there are so many. I've read it as, yes, you can. Yes, it is possible. Of course, there's one possible translation that was used in a 2008 presidential election. Yes, we can. Amongst those possible translations, there are some minor variations to them on the focus. Is it about you can do it or we can do it? I like the one that the book used myself, which is actually a rough literal translation of exactly those words. Yes, it can be done. I think that is a really universal way to look at that. Yes, it can be done. Yes, it is possible. Now, Maddie and Ross, with all their gunplay and talk of vengeance and riding down on 7 men with the guns ablazing, I think would be put to shame and outgritted, if outgritted is even a word, by the words, si se puede. It can be done. It can be done. Now, I don't know pre-planning on my part whatsoever. This is, of course, Cesar Chavez Day, and I just happen to be talking about Cesar Chavez. How do we celebrate Cesar Chavez Day? Well, in Maryland, we don't. In California, Colorado, and Texas, they do. How do they celebrate? Well, in reality, they just close a lot of things that would have been closed today anyway because it is Sunday on this particular Cesar Chavez Day. But it is not a federal holiday, and I'd like to quote the words of Barack Obama, who did declare Cesar Chavez Day to be an American day to be recognized. And he said he was calling on Americans to observe this day with appropriate service, community, and educational programs to honor Cesar Chavez's enduring legacy. I'll repeat that. Observe the day with appropriate service, community, and educational programs to honor Cesar Chavez's enduring legacy. Now, I think that sounds like a lovely idea. ¿Sí se puede? Sí se puede. Cesar Chavez, I see as a man of true grit in the same way it's defined by Charles Portis. I think it takes a lot of grit just to be a farm worker in the 1940s and 50s alone. But to do what he did, to march 300 miles, to draw recognition where recognition was absolutely impossible for the lowest workers in America at the time. And to say it can be done, let's do it. Let's do it. What a remarkable spirit that is. Now, so much of his life was summed up wonderfully in that little children's book I read earlier, but I'd like to expand on one of the stories that was in there. It was a story about how he and his family lost their ranch early on. In researching his life, I have to say that loss of that ranch was critical, was absolutely critical to him, and was a turning point in his life. It was shattering to him at an early age. And so I'm going to read a bit from the United Farm Workers website and the page that they have in honor of Cesar Chavez, and see if in this you find a little bit of the spark of grit, the same spark of grit you find in your Maddie Rosses in literature. Chavez learned about justice or injustice early in his life. He grew up in Arizona with that small adobe home, where he was born, and that was swindled from him by dishonest Anglos. Cesar's father agreed to a deal to clear 80 acres of land, and in exchange, he and his family would receive a deed to 40 acres of land that adjoined his house. So Cesar's father did this, and the agreement was broken, and the land was then sold to a different man named Justice Jackson. And Cesar's dad then went to a lawyer who advised him to borrow money and buy this land from Mr. Jackson. Later, Cesar's father couldn't pay interest on the loan that he borrowed, and the lawyer purchased the land from him. So his own lawyer took his home and his farm and then sold it to Justice Jackson, ripping off Cesar's father in no uncertain terms, forcing him to pack his family up and move to a barrio. He learned a lesson about injustice that he would never forget. Later, he said about this, "The love for justice that is in us is not only the best part of our beings, but is also the most true to our nature." Now, when they moved to the barrio, I read about that, and I started reading about his time there, and I was wondering if his famous slogan, "Si se puede," could possibly have been inspired by the name of the barrio he moved to. The name of the barrio was Sal si puedes, which translates to get out if you can. So the influence that Cesar Chavez has, the spirit of it that we are supposed to take away from his life story, is one about action. But I want to bring it back a little bit, back to True Grit. I'm going to flip-flop here a second. All of these acts that these three characters, two of them literature characters, one of them a real-life, living, breathing person who did amazing things, it always comes back to love in these stories. Maddie Ross does what she does because she loved her father, and she can't stand the thought of him just being gone without anyone taking notice of that, without anyone doing something about it. And so she sets out to do it, and then when asked why she's doing it, she says in a very biblical way, "I'm about my father's business," as if she walked right out of a parable. Cesar Chavez looks around at the people that he's working in the fields with. His is not a love of a specific person, but his is a love of humanity. His is a love of looking at these people and saying, if we cannot recognize a farm worker as a human being, then what love do we have inside of us? As we heard about in the reading earlier, there is faith and there is action. Cesar Chavez took action. It wasn't sweeping. In the story, that was a pretty good representation of how it was early on for him. He sat down in a room and said, I don't know what to do except for to get a couple people together and just talk. But it turns out that that was a really good first step for Cesar. And then that step became a march. And that march of 30 became a march of hundreds, and then a march of thousands. And then we see things change. If we're going to think about his spirit, then we have to think about what it is that we love. What is it in us that we have the ability or the passion or the time to change in our world? It doesn't have to be a big thing. We have been through, with this particular church, 3 years of interim ministry, and then we celebrate at the end. Perseverance. We persevere through as good news is on the horizon. We may have to pick up and move. I think that takes a little bit of grit. I think it takes a little bit of grit, not only to pick up and move and to lend a hand in doing so, but to be there and to stay through it. That takes a little bit of grit. You have to love something a little bit in order to find that grit inside yourself. I think it takes grit to go down to the West Side Men's Shelter and spoon out some food, or to sit down across from someone who's at the lowest point in their life and listen to their story. I think that there's some grit that I've learned from the people in here and watching that and being inspired by those who have done so. And to look beyond that, to look to those problems that don't seem like they have a solution. I read this sermon to my son yesterday, and I couldn't really end it. And here I am towards the end in the same spot. But what I said to him at the time, he said, why do you want to talk about this? You could just play the piano. And I said, that's true. That's true. I could. But the fact of the matter is that there are things that just completely set me off, right, about the world now, things that I cannot find reason in. We quibble a little bit with these things. We quibble with words. At this point, we're going on more than a year now where we have children who are separated from their families and locked away. And I say in jail. I say that they're in jail. And they say, no, it's not a jail, it's a camp. But it has bars and they can't leave. To me, that's a jail. I want to change that. I have no idea how. That lack of knowledge about how to proceed with that problem, it keeps me up, it wakes me up early. I read way more news than is healthy about this topic, and it weighs on me. I don't know what to do yet about that. But I know that there has to be a love for those children, the same way that Cesar Chavez had love for the workers in the field that he was beside every day. Someone has to make that right. Maybe not one person. Maybe it's not yes, you can. Maybe it's yes, we can. I don't know. I don't know the answer. But with all the challenges that we have ahead of us, the small ones, the daily ones, the ones at work, the ones at church, the ones in our community, the ones in our world, I think that we owe it to ourselves to look at those things with a little bit of grit in our soul and say, si se puede. It can be done. It can be done. It is possible. I will wrap up by telling you one more story for no other reason than to bridge the gap between here and what I'm going to play at the end of the day, because I am still your music director. This is a story of a man named Fitzgerald, referred to in South America as Fitzcarraldo. Now, Fitzgerald loved opera music. He loved it so much he wanted to build an opera house in Brazil. Now, he's poor, so he couldn't just build an opera house. So he said, I'm going to become as wealthy as these rubber barons that I see around me. I'm going to go harvest my own rubber. Well, they'd already bought the land. So what he did was he bought land way, 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 way up the river, sailed his boat up, harvested his rubber, and he couldn't get it back because the currents only go one way. So he made some rope out of some vine, and he dragged his boat right over the mountain down to the other side and back down the river. He dragged his whole steamship using only himself and his workers. Real man. That's something that takes grit. Same grit as we have in Matty Ross. Same grit as we find in the story of Cesar Chavez. Si se puede? Si se puede. Si se puede.